All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Nolan, and we have a lot of news to get into today regarding the Middle East, which seems to be our common theme here on the show. We got to touch on the latest developments from the current talks of the peace plan that Donald Trump laid out earlier this week on Monday at the White House with Benjamin Netanyahu. We got a lot of new developments in that department, and we're going to get into all of them today in detail right here on the show. Also, I do want to touch later on the show on the building military presence in the Middle East in regards to the conflict that could potentially be brewing with Iran. We're going to get into all this and more today on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.
End all of these wars. America is trying to play empire. We want everything released, and you're actively covering it up. It's not America first to be pushing our influence in areas where it shouldn't be. We're run by people that don't understand what they're doing and don't understand the ramifications of the policies they're enacting. That's an incredibly dangerous situation. All right, everybody, before we begin, if you wouldn't mind going right below this video and hitting like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. It helps me out a lot. We're almost at 100 subscribers, and I'd really like to hit that mark. So if everyone watching right now could go down below and hit like and subscribe, I would really greatly appreciate it. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and following all my pages over there, I would really appreciate that as well. But let's get right into the news. We had a bombshell article just recently out of Axios that gives us much greater insight into the behind-the-scenes developments during the talks on this 20-point peace plan between the Israelis and the Americans, as well as the other Arab leaders in the region. Pretty much, just so we can refresh on where we're at right now, what led to this, Donald Trump, for the past couple days, and really the past couple weeks, has been crafting this 20-point peace plan, which was originally a 21-point peace plan. He was crafting this plan for a couple weeks at this point, and we're going to get into it in a minute, but it was the Qatar Doha strikes that Israel conducted on September 9th that really started off this talks of developing a peace plan, and we're going to get into that in a second because that's all here in the Axios article. But on Monday, Donald Trump invited Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House for the fourth time in this first term, which is just a staggering statistic. Anyways, he invited him back to the White House where they discussed the potential of reaching a conclusion on this peace plan and presenting it to Hamas to accept, which they did. And Donald Trump also in the press conference unveiled that pretty much every major player in the region and the world signed off on it, from Pakistan to India to the Lebanese, all these major groups, Egypt, the Europeans, pretty much everybody who is a factor in this conflict signed off on this deal, seemingly. So he presents it to Benjamin Netanyahu to sign. He does, and they reach an agreement that they are now sending it to Hamas to be the final people to accept the deal. And in this press conference, Donald Trump tells Netanyahu, he assures him, that if Hamas doesn't accept the deal, then Israel has the full backing of the United States to do whatever it has to do, as he says. But then, a couple days later, I believe this came out yesterday, in Axios got a exclusive report about the true behind-the-scenes nature of Netanyahu's negotiations and what he really wanted to accomplish with this. But let's just set the stage real quick before we get into the article. Back home in Israel, Netanyahu is having serious political troubles due to these negotiations. His right flank in Israel, which includes prominent figures, which we've discussed before, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, his national security minister, that is the group that he's aligning himself with now, and they don't want to negotiate at all. They want to annex the West Bank, they want to annex Gaza, and they want to create greater Israel. And not to take any blame off of Netanyahu here, because obviously, if you go back and watch the tapes, he's wanted this for 30 plus years. So all this, the current government in Israel is largely made up of figures that don't want to negotiate with the Americans, don't want to negotiate with Hamas, and want to just finish the job, as they say. So that is the scene in Israel as these negotiations are going down. And if we look back at the history of negotiations between Israel, the Palestinians, and being mediated by the United States, Israel has a tendency to put poison pills in pretty much every negotiation, every move they make, set up the propaganda that they'll then use to further their agenda in the region. He was involved with Bill Clinton in negotiating with the Palestinians, and Netanyahu infamously now was on tape talking about during the negotiations, he poison-pilled the negotiations by saying that, for example, in the West Bank, he would give the Palestinians the West Bank, but he would make it in the negotiations. He would sneak it in and make it impossible for the Palestinians to want to accept it by saying that Israel maintained the right to occupy military lands, military territories in the West Bank. And he made it so that all of Area C, which is, there's multiple areas in the West Bank, all of Area C, which is a large portion of the West Bank, would be Israeli territory. So basically, Israel has a history of doing things like this to make the negotiations impossible to work with and use it as an excuse to present something unworkable to the Palestinians. And then when the Palestinians don't accept, they say, what, we offered them a state and they didn't take it, therefore we must be justified in going in and annexing this place or annexing Gaza or the West Bank. This is their common theme. Go back and read some history about these negotiations. It's crazy. This is what they do. And this Axios article, which I'm going to read right now, outlines how this instance of negotiations between the Trump administration and Netanyahu is basically another instance of this type of thing. So I'm just going to skip around in this article a little bit. The seeds of the plan President Trump presented on Monday to end... now I'm quoting the article, just so we're clear. The seeds of the plan President Trump presented on Monday to end the war in Gaza were planted 3 weeks earlier when Israel bombed Qatar in a failed attempt to assassinate Hamas leaders. The Israeli strike united Arab leaders in outrage against Prime Minister Netanyahu and intensified calls within Israeli society for a deal to free the remaining hostages and end the war. At first, outraged by the strike and the destabilization it could cause, Trump's advisors Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner soon saw the crisis as an opportunity to end the war, four sources with direct knowledge tell Axios. They noticed that the Arabs were speaking with one voice, even if it was to shout at Israel, a Trump advisor familiar with the discussions told Axios. It became clear, particularly to Steve, that this rallying cry that seemed negative at first could be turned into something positive. So what Axios is basically saying here is that sources close to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, true Trump advisors, are saying that these talks of coming up with this 20-point plan began a couple weeks back when, for those I covered it here on the show, when Israel struck Qatar, which is a U.S. ally that houses our biggest base in the region. They struck them to take out, basically, they say Hamas leaders in this. It was leaders and negotiators, which is a common theme you'll also find in how Israel conducts its targeted strikes. They try to go for the negotiators. That's what they did in Iran back in June. And this spurred, according to the source, the Trump administration and the White House to be looking for some sort of off-ramp here, to be looking for a peace deal, because they notice this is getting out of hand. And that Qatar strike enraged the White House and enraged the Arabs in the region, the leaders. And this basically, they thought gave Trump an opportunity to say, okay, enough, time to end this thing. So we'll continue reading here. And this is where we get into the behind the scenes of this was prior to their meeting on Monday. On Saturday, there was, I'll quote it now. This is from the article. Quote, on Saturday, a rumor spread among Trump's team that Netanyahu was planning to reject the plan, or at least demand sweeping changes. That led Trump to place a stern and clear call to Netanyahu, according to a source briefed on the conversation. Quote, Trump told Bibi in no uncertain terms, take it or leave it. And leave it means we walk away from you, the source said. Adding that when it comes to Netanyahu, quote, Donald Trump has had enough for many reasons. In all, Trump spoke 5 times on the phone with Netanyahu over the weekend, the sources said. Trump told Netanyahu he wanted a clear yes to the plan, not a yes but. So this now takes place. They're presenting this plan to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu very clearly doesn't want to take the plan. Trump is getting fed up with Netanyahu, which we've known now for a little while. We remember back when Trump tried to create the ceasefire between Iran and Israel back to end the 12-day war, 12 days so far war. Donald Trump had that famous scene on the tarmac, when he was getting onto the helicopter on the White House lawn, where he said they don't know what the F they're doing. Now, it's a little stupid that we consider that harsh towards Israel when that's like nothing towards Israel. But that was the harshest a U.S. president really has been rhetorically towards the Israelis. So that was a big shock for a day in the media. And also, we remember a couple days ago when a reporter asked Donald Trump in the Oval Office whether he would allow the Israelis to annex the West Bank. And Donald Trump said very firmly he will not allow it. So we've had many signs here, kind of indirect in most cases, but we've had many signs that Donald Trump is fed up with Netanyahu. We've had many signs just from Donald Trump's tone and his body language that Netanyahu is probably very difficult to negotiate with and work with behind the scenes, which if you ask pretty much go look at some of the things Bill Clinton has said about Netanyahu. I believe Obama has said some things about Netanyahu. Boris Johnson said some things about Netanyahu. He's very difficult to work with behind the scenes. Go look into some of these diplomats and what they've said about what it's like to work with him. He says one thing and does another and doesn't have any regard for the other people he's negotiating with. So this is a common theme. This has been known. Anyways, we'll continue off here. Quote, Trump accepted some of Netanyahu's edits, but rejected several others on issues that are politically sensitive within his hard-right coalition, one source said. Trump said he wouldn't ask Netanyahu to compromise on matters of security, but that didn't apply when the concern was domestic politics. Quote, if you accept this plan and Hamas rejects it, I will give you full backing to continue fighting them, Trump assured Netanyahu. Witkoff and Kushner held negotiations for hours with Netanyahu and Durham in New York. The talks concluded at 11 p.m. with both sides significantly narrowing the gaps, including over the language of the apology Netanyahu would have to make to Qatar. Quote, Netanyahu knew what he had to do. He didn't object. Give him credit. When he realized he had to do it, he did it, one of the sources recalled. Quote, now he wasn't raising his hands saying, choose me, but he got it done. And here is where we get to the part where we went over it. There was allegedly this meeting now between Kushner, Witkoff, and Netanyahu in New York late at night, basically editing this plan that Trump had presented to the Arab leaders, editing it in ways that are very favorable towards Israel, not an even-handed plan at all. And now, if you go read the plan, it's very clear. This is a plan that is completely one-sided. Basically what Hamas now has to do, and I don't even think I have to reiterate this, obviously Hamas should accept this deal. They should accept this deal because it's the best chance now to stop the suffering in Gaza, and it's the best chance to potentially get some aid in to the people in Gaza. For now, it stops the killing, and that is the main priority. Anyways, that is the first point. But the second point is the layout of this plan, the layout of these negotiations, make it so that Hamas has to trust the Israelis. They have to give up all their hostages and thus all their leverage, and they have to disarm and basically trust that in exchange, Israel is going to leave Gaza, and they're going to withdraw troops from Gaza. That is what this plan says. And, of course, I don't trust Hamas, but I also don't trust the Israelis whatsoever because they lie repeatedly. So if you're Hamas and you're negotiating now with this group that has lied over and over again and has broken these ceasefires time and time again throughout this conflict, why are you going to take that from a strategic angle? Not saying Hamas is moral, of course not. They're deeply immoral, evil people. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that Hamas shouldn't give up the hostages or shouldn't do this deal. I'm saying from a strategic standpoint, from negotiation standpoint, why would a party give up all of its leverage and give up all of its weapons to the other side and expect and just hope that the other side is going to keep their end of the bargain when they have proven time and time again that they won't? That's the point. And it's just an unreasonable deal to be asking of this other side. It's unreasonable. And it's purposely unreasonable because Netanyahu does not want peace. He's made this explicitly clear. He's repeatedly said this. And the people that have real power in his government, the Smotryches and the Ben-Gvirs, have said this repeatedly. Their goals in life, they've made this clear for decades, specifically Netanyahu. His goal in life, his whole doctrine, the Netanyahu doctrine, is based upon the creation of Greater Israel, which means the eventual annexation of Gaza and the West Bank and the acquisition of pieces of land from Syria and Lebanon. That is the goal. They've made this clear. It's in their own words. So why now, when Hamas is so beaten back, when they have the leverage over Hamas that they do, And they have taken out all these leaders throughout the region. They've got a friendly government to them now in Syria. And they've defeated Hezbollah in Lebanon. When all their threats in the region are basically on their back foot, why would they now, if you're thinking from Israel's perspective, why would we expect Netanyahu now to be like, okay, now it's time for peace? He's conducting a 7-front war and is trying to become a regional hegemon. And we think now he's going to try and find peace because Donald Trump says a few mean words in a press conference? I don't buy it at all. So we're going to continue here because this talks about the Arab leaders' reaction to the edits that were made in the peace plan. Quote, when the latest text was sent to the Arab and Muslim officials, they were furious at how many changes Netanyahu had managed to insert, particularly in the terms of Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, sources familiar with the talks say. Quote, Bibi told Trump in their calls over the weekend that he won't just withdraw and let Hamas reconstitute, an Israeli official said. Trump concurred. Arab countries had also pushed for changes to the text, but many were left out. The objections were strong enough that the Qataris advised Trump's team not to release the detailed plan on Monday. Trump published the plan anyways. He said Tuesday that he expects an answer from Hamas in the next 3 or 4 days. The U.S. and Israeli officials expect a positive response with some reservations. So, here, let me actually, one more quick part. This is important. Throughout Tuesday, Arab officials gave Trump's team status reports and indicated positive movement from Hamas, one source said. Despite issuing a joint statement welcoming Trump's announcement, Arab officials have made it clear they believe the deal is still being negotiated and details aren't settled. A U.S. official said further specific tweaks are possible, but Trump doesn't intend to renegotiate the entire plan. So basically what's happening here, and it says it here later on in the article, Trump is hoping that the Arab leaders, specifically, as it says here, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, are going to get Hamas to say yes to this deal. I hope that too. I hope they say yes to this deal because then it's on Israel now, which we like, let's just make it very clear, as I've said already. It's very obvious that Israel doesn't want peace. I don't believe for a second that Netanyahu wants peace. I think he's gone so far to this point that there's no turning back now. And he's made his motives crystal clear. And anyone who doesn't see them now has not been paying attention. I won't accept that this is going to happen until it actually happens because there's just a whole history of the Israelis going back on their word. And if we've learned anything from the Israelis, it's that words mean nothing and actions actually mean nothing. Actions actually mean something and words mean nothing. Because the Israelis for decades have said their biggest propaganda line is that they've offered the Palestinians a state 5 times and they've rejected it. The easiest one to debunk because every single time Israel was negotiating in incredibly bad faith. But this is going to be, I have a feeling, if I had to predict right now how this is going to go, I think Hamas is going to have a problem with a couple points. Israel is going to use that as justification to continue the war. And in 5 years, we'll be hearing that Israel's actually offered the Palestinians a state 6 times, and they rejected every single one. Because Israel's basically been allowed to orchestrate the terms in this deal. You heard it here in this article. Netanyahu had a private meeting with Witkoff and Kushner in New York where they made some tweaks in this deal to make it very favorable towards Israel. So if Hamas doesn't accept this, we know why. And they're going to make it seem like Hamas doesn't want peace. And you're going to hear why you guys are, you think Israel offered them peace. That's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear Israel offered them peace. Hamas rejected it. Israel finished the job. That's what you're going to hear from the shills in the media. But if anyone who actually is paying attention, this is why it's important to pay attention to the details of this stuff. People who've actually been paying attention to the details and the fact that Netanyahu was allowed a private meeting with the Americans to tweak this deal to make it more favorable towards Israel and their plans to withdraw from Gaza. By the way, Netanyahu also got he negotiated the Israelis to have veto power over this entire plan. So if the Israelis change their mind at all throughout this plan about withdrawing from Gaza, they can just simply veto it and go back to invading Gaza. So this plan is overwhelmingly tilted towards Israel. And now they're going to use that. Netanyahu has basically poisoned the negotiations and made it much more likely that Hamas will reject the deal. And when Hamas rejects the deal, because it's favorable towards the Israelis, they're going to use that as justification to continue their mass slaughter campaign and orchestrate and create greater Israel. That's what's happening here. So it's incredibly important to pay attention to that. I do also want to touch on real quick the latest with the conflict that could be brewing with Iran. Now, as we covered last episode, or a couple episodes ago, I believe, we talked about the military buildup that was potentially going to be occurring in the region. For those who don't recall, at the United Nations, the Europeans imposed snapback sanctions on the Iranians, meaning that they concluded that Iran was not abiding by the Iran nuclear deal, and therefore they were going to impose sanctions on the Iranian regime. Now, these sanctions come as Iran is facing hunger and drought and poverty, basically, what's happening right now. The Iranian regime is under real pressure from its own people, and these sanctions make that much worse. So this comes in an environment now where the Iranian regime is weighing its options here for survival, because they are under domestic threat at this point. And what do regimes, and also they're facing incredible international pressure from their other regional rival, which is Israel. And if Iran's regime actually feels under threat, then they have threatened now to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And essentially what that means is that they would, that would give us no other choice than to assume that they are rushing towards a nuclear bomb. So that is the situation as of a couple days ago in Iran. And we have some new updates here. We have two very interesting articles from Newsweek that give us some insight on what's going on the ground right now. So this first one is titled, Iran is, quote, preparing for potential military conflict. This is from yesterday, October 1st. Quote, officials in Iran believe that the ceasefire with Israel will collapse and that conflict will resume in the future, according to the Institute for the Study of War. The assessment by the Washington, D.C. think tank outlined how Iran's Supreme National Security Council had directed military and civilian officials to designate successors in the event that leadership disruption to ensure continuation in the event of war. So they are preparing, and it says here coming up in just a second, they are preparing for the possibility of a future conflict. Quote, the ISW said Iran's Armed Forces General Staff Chief Major General Abdul Rahim Mousavi inspected military units on Tuesday, during which he said that the Islamic Republic's naval force had achieved full readiness, quote, for a possible future conflict. So the Iranians now are making it very clear that they are building up their military, they are readying their troops for the potential of a war with Iran, a continuation of the 12-day war, a continuation of the conflict for the exact same reasons. Now, much of this talk that Iran is going after a bomb has been going on for 30 plus years and is largely a lie. Is not true that Iran is on the fast track to developing a bomb right now. What they have right now is what is essentially known as nuclear hedging. They have enriched uranium to a point, basically showcasing, it's very similar to what Japan has. They're showcasing that they could make a bomb. They have the technology and the knowledge to make a nuclear weapon, but they aren't. If they feel threatened, they will have no choice, they are saying, than to make a bomb. But they have the technology right now that if they wanted to make a bomb, they could. That's essentially the state it is. It's called nuclear hedging. They're hedging their bets. And Israel says that is completely unacceptable. The main reason for this is because that would threaten Israel's ability to continue the foreign policy that they've conducted for 30 years at this point, of overthrowing regime after regime after regime. And at the end of the line of regimes is Iran. This is made clear in their own writings. They want to overthrow Iran. We know this because back in June, when they were conducting their strikes, Israel conducted their strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. They also struck regime targets. They tried to assassinate, and they did assassinate multiple members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They tried to assassinate nuclear scientists, and they tried to assassinate different diplomats and negotiators. So Israel is making a play towards regime change, and they have been for 30 plus years. Back in the later years of George W. Bush's term, they were trying to pressure President Bush to invade Iran, because if you go back, I've said it multiple times, but if you read the Clean Break memo from 1996, which is basically the outline of Netanyahu's foreign policy doctrine, they wanted to conclude regime change with Iran because they were the last stronghold, basically, of power that was restricting Israel from becoming a regional superpower. Because Israel can't simply, number one, overthrow regimes in the region at will, and they can't treat the Palestinians in the way that they have been and basically kick them out of their land if they have Iran threatening to fund terror proxies and actively funding terror proxies like Hezbollah and like the Houthis in the region that are threatening Israel and giving Israel a hard time as they try and conduct their war activities. So Israel right now is trying to get regime change in Iran, and they're trying to get the U.S. to back it. It's not even that they're trying to get America to back it. They're trying to get America to simply conduct a regime change in Iran. This was what they did in 2003 after 9/11. They used the Americans' mourning from 9/11 and the fear of another terrorist attack to basically lobby the Americans into overthrowing Iraq for Israel. And we know this was for Israel because we had Netanyahu coming to Congress multiple times in the buildup to 9/11, or excuse me, in the buildup to the invasion of Iraq, and lobbying completely on behalf of his own country and his own country's interests for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. They also lobbied for the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, which we did, basically. And he advocated for the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, which we also assisted in. So this has been Netanyahu's goal for his entire time as Prime Minister of Israel. He has wanted to get the United States into war after war in the Middle East, to overthrow countries on his behalf, to make it much easier for him to suppress the Palestinians and create greater Israel without pressure from other regional superpowers. So the reason that he wants Iran overthrown is because it's the end of the line. If Iran goes, so does the rest of the Middle East, and they go into Israeli influence, where Iran is the last remaining superpower that has much influence in the Middle East. So if Iran falls, then the rest of the Middle East essentially falls to Israeli influence. That is the situation that we're in right now in the region. And this other article I wanted to touch on real quick talks about the fact that the United States is actively preparing for war as well. They don't want to tell you this, but we're going to trust me. This is how it goes. We have no information in the mainstream media. And by the way, before we get into this article, I have to just say, touching on that topic, you haven't heard a thing, I guarantee it, in mainstream media. You turn on Fox News or CNN or any of these channels, I bet you haven't heard a thing about the article I read to you before from Axios about Netanyahu's behind his wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. You haven't heard a thing about that, but that's desperately important to know. I bet you haven't heard a thing about what we're going to cover here. The fact that the U.S. is actively deploying military assets to the region right now at the levels that we were before the war with Iran back in June, the 12-day war. Why is this not newsworthy? Exactly. Why? Tell me why this is not newsworthy exactly. Why is our mainstream media just collapsing in front of our eyes? I know that mainstream media has lost influence, largely because of the 2024 election, and the fact that they completely lied to us about Joe Biden's mental health, and about COVID, and about Ukraine, and about 9/11, and about all these things. We know this. But the fact that they can't even be bothered to report about the military buildup in the Middle East is just, it speaks to the level that they're at right now, which is insignificance. So anyways, we had to get that out there. But right now, and this is the quote from Newsweek, a massive wave of U.S. Air Force KC-135 Stratotankers has moved into the Middle East, marking one of the largest aerial refueling deployments in recent months. Flight tracking shows aircraft departing from Atlantic bases, converging on Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, headquarters of U.S. Central Command. The deployment signals a noticeable increase in U.S. military readiness in the region amid rising tensions with Iran, which has issued threats of retaliation against any attack. The sudden deployment of dozens of KC-135 tankers comes amid a highly volatile regional environment. Similar large-scale military movements were observed just before the 12-day conflict involving Israel and U.S. strikes on Iran's infrastructure and nuclear facilities. Tensions have been further fueled by stalled nuclear negotiations with Tehran and ongoing sanctions, all of which heightened the risk of rapid confrontation. The concentration of aerial refueling capability in Qatar ensures the U.S. forces can respond quickly across the region, underscoring the strategic implications of this deployment. Open source intelligence, including military tracking accounts on X, highlighted the sudden deployment. Defense Index wrote, around a dozen U.S. Air Force KC-135 Stratotankers and other refuelers that moved to Europe in the past 48 hours are now headed towards the Middle East. The Post added that the last comparable mobilization coincided with the U.S. actions against Iran's nuclear facilities. So this is what we're seeing right now building up in the Middle East. We are seeing rising tensions and rising military presence in the Middle East from the United States in preparation for the eventual collapsing of diplomacy and in preparation for a potential part 2 of the war in Iran. Now, you've seen, we all saw people in the aftermath of the Iran war bragging about how over this was and bragging that all you losers who were concerned about it have been proven wrong again, and you should lose all your credibility, and you were all fear-mongering, and you're so stupid. Basically, all these insults against people who are non-interventionist by people who have vested interest in seeing war continue. And this now seemingly goes against their narrative that this was over. What I've thought to myself for the last couple months since the 12-day war ended was that was probably just halftime, because there was no real deal that came out of it. And if there was no deal that came out of it, then inevitably this was going to be a conflict again. And once it came out that the United States didn't seem to actually do a terrible amount of damage against the nuclear facilities, and that the enriched uranium wasn't really damaged, there was no deal, and the enriched uranium is intact. So what does that tell us? There's probably going to be, and by the way, Israel is ramping up its conflicts around its borders right now. They're a 7-front war at the moment. So all these factors just lead us to the conclusion that there's going to be inevitably another conflict here, because none of the factors on the ground changed, and the factors that did change lead us to the conclusion that there's probably going to be another conflict, because that all these factors that have changed lead to the rising of tensions. So all of this is just to say that, again, as I've been saying for a while now, this is far from over. Anyone telling you that it is over, and anyone who's saying that if you think it's not over, you're a fearmonger, is just full of it. So, because this is the reality on the ground. This is a Newsweek article, and there's different. Go on X right now and find some military tracking accounts. They're all saying that aircraft is moving to the Middle East, preparing for war at the levels that we saw pre-Iran war, pre-12-day war back in June. So all this is just stuff to keep in mind, keep your eye on, because tensions are rising, and for some reason, the mainstream media is failing its people by choosing to not tell them about it. So this is the factors on the ground at the moment. But that is where I think I will conclude it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to follow me on all my other accounts on Instagram, X, and Spotify. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.